does it mean it's the end for your restaking thesis?
So it's very expensive to build liquidity for those assets, or even to try to rely on external players like market makers, because they also have a very high cost of capital. The adoption and the scaling of those assets was still blocked by the lack of liquidity. If we solve the liquidity bottleneck of the assets, then they would be able to scale faster.
So where does this competitive advantage come from and how defensible it is?
If we make the RWAs liquid, then they will become more DeFi composable.
What are the biggest risks that your clients must be aware?
Who is your dream client for Symbiotic at this point?
Hi everyone, and welcome to Onchain Honestly,
a podcast about what actually works in crypto as a business.
We're long-term believers in this space, and we want more honest conversations about what's changing and why.
So we explore real models, practical outcomes, and what it takes to build something that lasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Onchain Honestly, and we're your co-hosts, Kaiser and Alenka. Today, everyone's talking about the tokenization of real-world assets. Everyone's so excited. Everyone's so impressed by the recent growth that we've achieved as an industry. But unfortunately, a large challenge still remains, and that's the liquidity. In DeFi, we're so accustomed to a very high capital velocity, to instant redemptions, to really, really high speed. And that's unfortunately not the case for RWAs as of yet. And this is exactly the problem that Symbiotic is trying to tackle. Having made its name in restaking, the team is now heavily pivoting into RWAs, credit, and insurance. And today we have Henrique, product lead for Liquid Lane at Symbiotic, to unpack all of this with us. Henrique, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so Henrique, look, we met with you a couple months back. I think it was ECC, but we unfortunately never got to properly chat about this pivot that you mentioned to me back in March. And again, to me personally, it came as a surprise because we've always known Symbiotic as one of the largest risk-taking players out there in the market. And now this pivot into providing this liquidity layer for RWAs, credit, and insurance. So we're very curious to understand the reasoning behind it and to really answer this very direct question, like, does it mean it's the end for your restaking thesis at all, or is it kind of something that you're building on top what you've previously built?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. I wouldn't say we are pivoting exactly in that sense. We just understood that our knowledge and the infra that we have built already can be applied to many other use cases. So previously, more on the restaking side of things, the collateral was used by those infra-heavy staking protocols in the space to decentralize their networks. But collateral can actually be used for a lot more use cases, including economic guarantees, insurance and underwriting, and now for Liquid Lane and the liquidity use case. So we have the infra and the tooling already designed for that more niche use case. We are effectively now expanding that and tackling different use cases that are very composable with the ones that we have already. So it's not effectively moving from one to the other, but simply expanding the scope of Symbiotic itself by tackling new problems, by solving real issues, and by effectively scaling and accessing a broader market as well.
Let's maybe take a bit deeper dive into this new product that you've recently released, which is Liquid Lane, for which you're leading the whole product direction, as well as this core V2 that you're launching actually very, very soon.
Yes. So we're upgrading Symbiotic to the V2, and the main difference over the V1 is that capital can now be used externally to Symbiotic itself as well. So previously, the capital was simply sitting in the Symbiotic vault to provide these collateral guarantees to the multiple applications on the infra side. But now we are allowing curators to access yield from external sources as well. So to make the strategies more capital efficient and to become as appealing as possible from the yield standpoint. So we are allowing them, the curators in this case, to whitelist some external DeFi protocols to, let's say, earn passive yield. And at the same time, we are also allowing them to access capital to provide liquidity to some RWAs. Curators can access capital outside of the protocol itself, but we encode the actions that they can take. So it's not fully accessing the capital to their own EOAs or multisigs. We built this infra and the tooling that allows yield to come from external sources, but we effectively encode what's possible and what's not, actually, when they essentially whitelist external yield sources. And Liquid Lane is the first product built on top of the V2 that effectively enables RWAs to become liquid on chain and then to be integrated in other DeFi protocols. And everything is done because we have the V2 in place.
I'm sure that Alenka will have quite some good questions about the liquidity side of RWAs. But maybe before we go a bit deeper into that part, let's also talk about the capital efficiency, because I think you're stating that you will manage to make the capital like around 70% more efficient. But would you be able to elaborate a bit more on who actually captures most of the value economically? And maybe we could go like ecosystem participant by participant. So, where does Symbiotic fit into that equation? How do you monetize the infrastructure? But also, from all the players' side, who gets paid?
Sure. So we understood that the current and existing solutions to build liquidity for RWAs and other tokenized assets weren't very efficient from that standpoint. So it's very expensive to build liquidity for those assets if you try, let's say, to set up a DEXLP as an example, or if you try to have capital available yourself, or even to try to rely on external players like market makers because they also have a very high cost of capital. So the current solutions, they wouldn't work simply because they were either too expensive or the liquidity wasn't going to be available in the first place. So we designed this to maximize the capital efficiency of the collateral that sits in the vault. And that happens because between these redemption timestamps, between the redemption events, you would be getting yield from other sources. So external DeFi protocols, you can also get yield from existing Symbiotic applications. And then when an RWA needs liquidity or an asset manager wants to exit the position instantly, you would be able to access that just-in-time liquidity. Of course, you don't continue earning the yield that comes from the external DeFi protocols as an example, but you would be getting the yield that comes from the discount and then the RWA that you are acquiring. So because we have the infra and access to all these different yield sources, some of them exclusive when it comes to the Symbiotic natively integrated applications, we can effectively build this very capital efficient solution. According to our analysis, it can generate higher returns than the existing DEXLP solutions. And that's one of the reasons we are focusing a lot on the Liquid Lane product itself.
And Henrique, to put it into a more practical framework, let's imagine I'm an asset issuer, right? So I want to issue a token that would be, let's say, tokenized credit. So I want to provide financing for a particular export transaction, right? Let's say within the field of trade finance. So I've issued this token. I have some token holders, and I would want to tap into this, single liquidity layer that you guys have created. Could you walk me through the entire process?
Sure. So there are two steps to have assets available on the Symbiotic platform for the market makers to provide liquidity for, and the curators in this case. So we first analyze the assets ourselves, the Symbiotic team. So we have a first due diligence process on our side, and that involves understanding the mechanics of the asset itself, the risks associated to both the tokenized version and the underlying fund as well, or in this case, the trade receivable product. So we process our DD, and then we also need to analyze the asset interfaces and if it's composable with our existing solution. That would be the first stage. We also, in the meantime, discuss this possibility with existing Symbiotic curators and market makers to gather their interest and effectively understand if they would be able to commit some of their capital from the Symbiotic vault to that asset in terms of available liquidity.
Do you have many of them working with you already?
Yes. So we have the curators on the V1 side, and those are mainly risk managers,
Mhm.
some liquid funds as well. And then on the V2, we are onboarding quite a few market makers as well. So we announced a few of them already, and Fasanara is going to be the first one live to whitelist the Midas assets to start with. But effectively, we have that two-stage due diligence process. We proceeded first ourselves, mainly on the interface side, and then the risks associated with the protocol and the tokenized version. And then, of course, the curators, market makers, that would then provide that liquidity from their vault. They also need to run their due diligence process. They need to be comfortable with the setup, with the redemption process. They would need to have KYC with some of the issuers if required, if the asset is permissioned. So there are a few factors that we need to effectively address, discuss with the curator as well, and then we effectively whitelist the asset by building an adapter that encodes the redemption path. This is because we don't want to allow the market maker or curator to access the vault capital directly. That would impose additional risks to the vault stakers in the first place. So effectively encode and whitelist what is allowed. And in that case, that would be simply redeeming the RWA with the issuer and returning USDC or other stablecoins back to the Symbiotic platform. So that is encoded on our side, and that's what we call whitelisting the RWAs and the tokenized assets. As soon as that is done, curators can simply go through the curator UI that they have available to them and simply define the RWAs that they are comfortable with and want to provide liquidity for, and simply define some parameters, including, let's say, the discount, the minimum discount at which they want to acquire the RWA.
Right. So it would mean that multiple market makers or curators could potentially provide liquidity for a redemption that I, as a user, have just requested for a particular RWA asset that is whitelisted by your team, and then that is also, double, triple checked by every risk curator.
Exactly. Yes. So we whitelist
So
in the first stage.
they will be bidding, right, to provide this liquidity.
Exactly. So in an RFQ based process. That's correct.
Right. But there could be potentially a situation where let's say you would whitelist the asset itself, but then no one would be bidding to provide liquidity for a particular asset. Could it be so?
So before we whitelist, we understand if there will be demand from the curators and
Mm.
market makers. So if we understand that some of them are interested, then we would proceed with whitelisting the asset. If we don't see demand, we may not prioritize it, and we may discuss that with the asset issuer and see if they can, let's say, point us to one curator that they work with. And then we'll be working with that curator and see if the setup is
Mhm.
works on their side as well, let's say. So that could happen, but it shouldn't, simply because we also take into account the feedback and the interests of the curators themselves.
Okay. So now that we've covered this part on, like liquidity provisioning, so on the what happens on the user side? Let's go into that part as well.
So Symbiotic is still, I still see it as a marketplace where we have two types of users. We have the ones that want to exit the RWA positions immediately and access stable coins atomically. And then on the other side, we have users or capital allocators that want to earn yield on their deposits. So, and Symbiotic is the platform that effectively matchmakes the two sides, because we have the infra and we have also the curators managing the parameters and the vaults themselves directly. So, from the user standpoint, we effectively can redeem the RWAs that the curators had whitelisted, and that is done when a user interacts with a Symbiotic UI and requests the swap. So then we are targeting, let's say, institutional funds, RWA holders, or even banks that offer RWAs to their clients. And then on the capital allocator side, we are targeting similar institutions in the sense that they would be comfortable with RWA exposure. Not the exposure would be less than holding the asset directly, but you are still exposed during the redemption period. And on that side, we are targeting similar institutions, so like on-chain yield funds, some capital allocators in general, some neobanks as well that want to access yield from more uncorrelated sources, and effectively anyone that wants to access more higher yield sources and uncorrelated ones as well.
Right. And then all this liquidity. So you're essentially creating like a single layer, right? But then there would be vaults for every asset separately.
So the Symbiotic Vault takes a single collateral asset. And for Liquidline for V2, that would be USDC and other stablecoins to start with. And on that side, yes, they are isolated per asset that the vault accepts. But then you can use a single Symbiotic Vault to redeem as many RWAs as you want. So the liquidity is pooled between the RWAs that the market maker curator wants to whitelist. Also to make it as capital efficient as possible. Like currently on the XLPs, it's even more expensive simply because you need to create a single liquidity pool per RWA that you want to build liquidity for. So you then need to incentivize, you need to give rewards to try to like bring liquidity to that single LP. But then if you have 10 different RWAs that you want to make liquid, then you need to replicate that 10 different times. In the case like 10 times more expensive and it's not capital inefficient. So we are solving that also by allowing curators to use a single vault and provide liquidity to as many assets as they want.
But it will still depend on a particular risk curator, right? So it's essentially not a
Correct.
single layer of liquidity that would, cover all the assets that are using this infrastructure. It still depends on the particular curator, correct?
That's correct. Yes, exactly.
Okay. And Rick, actually going back to Kaiser's question on, who earns what in this entire stack, in this entire flow that you've just described. So can we go just step by step, starting with, let's say, risk curators and market makers, then also covering you as a platform, and then ultimately LPs and users. So what's the business model here, and what are these different monetization layers? And, also like stemming from this capital efficiency thesis that you guys are building upon.
Sure. So there are two types of fees on the Symbiotic platform that curators, market makers can charge. There's the maintenance fee that is charged on the AUM, and then there's the performance fee. But we are not imposing or we are not constraining the strategies that the curators want to implement there. So some of them may specify a single AUM maintenance fee. The other ones may simply define a performance fee that they want to charge. And we, of course, impose limits there because it wouldn't make sense to charge 100% of maintenance fee. You would drain the vault. So we are restricting that limit simply for safety measures. But the curators can simply specify if they want to charge 1, 2, 3%. We are not restricting them on those limits at the lowest level, so just for safety measures. The vault stakers, the capital allocators, those would be getting the majority of the fees because they are effectively putting the capital at risk. So they would be getting the yields, let's say 80% of the yield that comes from the RWA redemptions, from external DeFi protocols, and also from the Symbiotic applications. Then Symbiotic and the curator, we could charge at the performance side level. So we don't plan to charge, at least at the beginning after releasing the V2, but we may add a performance fee of, let's say, 10% later down the road. And we are expecting the curators to do the same. So starting without an AUM fee and then potentially adding a performance fee of something between 10 and 20%.
Yeah, this is very much in line with what we're seeing in the industry overall. Even if you look at Gauntlet's website, right, we don't really see any success or performance fee for the majority of vaults they're creating. So I think everyone is really at this, growth and scaling stage, not willing to overcharge the user and risking, to lose them.
Exactly.
But I think maybe that's also a good jump to cover a bit of the competitive landscape and what really differentiates you from others, maybe replicating a similar system. So where does this competitive advantage come from and how defensible it is? I understand that a lot is playing with the fees and, as you just said, just offering the product and finding clients. But what's
Mhm.
your strategy there?
So we do see quite a few players in the space that are building one of these single verticals. So we do have players that build infra effectively to allow strategies that include external DeFi protocols, but those usually don't touch anything RWA or liquidity related and don't have access to, of course, natively integrated Symbiotic applications. We also do have some players that focus more on the liquidity side and want to build this a liquidity layer to effectively make those assets more liquid on the secondary market. But the value prop of Symbiotic lies on the fact that we actually combined those three different yield sources and make it as capital efficient as possible. Because let's say if we simply focused on building a liquidity layer for RWAs without accessing yield from other DeFi protocols or even from the Symbiotic applications, that wouldn't be compelling enough or wouldn't be as capital efficient as it could be because the yield would be coming only from RWA redemptions. The problem would then be, okay, how can we convince capital allocators to deposit capital there if we don't have guarantees that an RWA redemption would ever happen? So that would be a problem. And to solve this problem, we are effectively combining that solution with the other yield sources. And one of the main differences or factors that differentiate Symbiotic is that we do have access to exclusive yield sources that come from the integrated applications that we have. Some of them, of course, can rely on other vault infra as well. So CAP is an example of that, but the majority of the capital lies on Symbiotic. So they do have a few hundred mil in delegations from Symbiotic vaults, and vault stakers do access the yield that comes from the cap side itself. And it's by effectively mixing these different strategies and yield sources that we can build the best product out there and the most capital efficient one, which is exactly what we are optimizing for.
And by the way, Enrique, do not hesitate to name those companies that you're referring to. I think I've seen like two at least new, very young products emerging there, like Fission and Multi-Liquid, right? Which I think are building also like infrastructure, particularly for RWA redemptions. But if you could maybe name a few more.
So there are other players working on that. There's Upshift that launched the RWA Redeem Vault for USDC. And there's also Grove with Basin, and they are building something related more towards market neutral funds and money market funds.
So, Enrique, I don't want to like hyper focus on this pivot because, again, that's maybe just, a large product iteration because obviously this, shared security layer still remains going back to the inherent intrinsic nature of Symbiotic as a risk-taking protocol. But anyway, on your website, I saw three very clearly listed directions, let's say. So one is this product for credit protocols, credit issues, insurance, and then liquid lane, which we already covered. So let's maybe focus for a moment on the first two. What is the traction that you're seeing there? You did mention cap already, which essentially falls into the first direction, which is credit, right?
Exactly.
But what about insurance? And if you want to add something on top, like we definitely would love to hear more numbers and how exactly you're assessing the results so far.
Yeah, it's a good question as well. So, as you mentioned, on the credit side, we are working closely with CAP. They do have the delegations that come mainly from the Symbiotic vaults. And we do have a few hundred mil there, mainly coming from Bitcoin derivatives. I can mention Bedrock as one of the main ones there as well. So with UniBTC delegations to effectively underwrite the operations of well-known market makers in the space. So in terms of traction, we do have a lot with them specifically, mainly on the Bitcoin derivative side, as I mentioned, to start with. We will then scale to other assets as well. So now that we'll have the V2, We can effectively onboard some yield-bearing stablecoins as well. We can onboard money market funds on the delegation side of things. So we are looking to that right now to then scale the adoption of CUSD, which is the cap stablecoin, and then more on the insurance side of things. So we'll be working with very relevant players in the space. Nexus Mutual is one of them. So we are building this tranching mechanism that allows them to underwrite additional policies when by relying on capital collateral that sits on the Symbiotic vault layer effectively. So the insurance market is huge considering the on-chain and the off-chain space. So it's something that we are looking into very closely. Let's start with Nexus Mutual, and we are allowing them to effectively define the parameters, the terms of the policies that they want to focus on. And Symbiotic would be the capital market layer that will allow them to effectively underwrite the policies in the first place.
Right. I think that's really your moat, your differentiation point, that you're trying to bring all these different pieces of the puzzle together. And again, given, years of experience and years of building this network, building these relationships, this is something obviously on top of very robust infra that you guys have built, would really give you a competitive advantage over any new player that would want to appear and compete in this niche.
Yes, definitely one of the main focus is to build the infra to allow all the use cases to come together and then make the strategies as efficient as possible for everyone.
Right. And Henrik, just for a moment, I would want to become the devil's advocate here, and I refer to one of the statements that I think I saw on your X profile. I mean, on Symbiotic's X profile or somewhere else. But anyway, I even wrote it down for myself. So it states tokens lending protocols previously had to avoid because liquidation was unreliable can now be onboarded with the risk profile they're willing to underwrite. Right. So if that's true, let's maybe talk about this democratization of the market, really opening the path to long tail RWAs, apart from those tokens that we see across similar infrastructure solutions like Accurate token, right? Tokens by Janus Henderson, which they launched in Centrifuge, MF1, M Global by Fasanara that you mentioned in reference to Midas,
Yes.
USCC, and many other players. So my point is they are the largest RWA tokens out there, right? They are issued by the largest, global asset managers, the players that we would label as established and very, trusted and reliable. And of course, that's where the majority of liquidity is concentrated. So it's not, I don't want to say like it's not rocket science, but no, I mean, no wonder they are the ones everyone is starting with, right? That's where the first pulls on the horizons appeared, et cetera, et cetera. And even, taking the example
Exactly.
of Liquid Lane, you're starting with Fasanara, with M Global, MF1 on Midas. So my question is, when will we see smaller assets appear there as well? And again, because as we now understand, you are the player that is whitelisting those tokens to appear on, Liquid Lane. So when will we see the real democratization? And will we? What are the parameters that you're looking at first thing?
Mhm. Sure. So we want to scale with the asset issuers as well. We understood as well that the adoption and the scaling of those assets was still blocked by the lack of liquidity of the underlying assets. So we think that if we solve the liquidity bottleneck of the assets, then they would be able to scale faster and grow even more than what we've seen recently as well for some of the main assets available on either Morpho or Aave Horizon. So the main problem to start with was simply that you wouldn't get the liquidation guarantees if you listed those assets on a lending market as collateral. Because the market makers, they have very high cost of capital, so they wouldn't want to liquidate it in the first place if the premium wouldn't be high enough. So you need to effectively find someone, probably sign an agreement with one of those entities to have some liquidation guarantees. And then only after that, the market maker, the lending markets could list the RWAs collateral. So it's a very manual and inefficient process as well. So for the lending markets and for the curators of those lending markets to be comfortable with listing those assets, we need to get these liquidity guarantees. And those would come from the Symbiotic liquidity layer, liquid lane in this case. So that solves the first part of the problem, which is getting the assets listed. And then the second part is to allow the RWA holders to access USDC from the lending markets themselves. So by using the RWA as collateral and then re-accessing USDC so they are liquid again. And Symbiotic would backstop the liquidations in some of those lending markets by integrations that we have with Redstone Settle as an example as well. So we would also be focusing on that side of things. And it's precisely that, this process of simply listing the RWA, accessing more stablecoins USDC by borrowing them from the lending market, and then having a looping strategy in place that we think would allow the asset issuers to grow and scale as well. As we've seen with LSTs, LRTs when they launched to start with, so you had a lot of these looping strategies, the DVL scaled. I think that if we make the RWAs liquid, then more people would be comfortable accessing the underlying yields. And in the second stage, if they're more liquid, they will become more DeFi composable. So that will be one of the main reasons that could make an asset manager holding the tokenized version of the fund over the fund off chain directly.
And I think to start slowly wrapping up this episode, we have a couple of questions left, I think. But I really also wanted to cover the risk element here. So maybe if you could highlight what are like the biggest risks that your clients must be aware when they would like to integrate with you, just to be very transparent. What are the disclaimers that you give them that be aware or take into consideration?
Yeah, so that would be definitely related to the RWAs and the assets that we whitelist and the curators whitelist as well through the Symbiotic vaults. And those risks are related, let's say, to NAV changes. So usually the NAV goes up, but it could happen that you have some drawdowns and then there are some losses on the underlying fund. So effectively, the vault share price could decrease, and you are exposed to that risk during the withdrawal queue of the asset issuers. So that's like one of the main risks, but it needs to be assessed individually on an asset basis. So it really depends on the asset. Asset allocators, capital allocators also need to take that into account and do their own due diligence when deploying capital to the Symbiotic vault that supports different types of RWAs. So you need to understand how each of them work from the asset integration side. So how the asset is structured on chain to then how the underlying fund works in the first place and the exposure that the fund has. Because if a fund defaults, then the value of the tokenized version would decrease as well or be like wiped out. So that's one of the risks. Then it could happen that redemptions of the RWAs are gated. And because of that, capital may be returned to the Symbiotic vault at the later stage after the underlying fund unlocks liquidity. So that's another risk that wouldn't pose necessarily a decrease of the vault shares, but it may effectively make it more illiquid in the second stage. So those are two of the main risks that we mention when we discuss this with capital allocators. And then, of course, you also have Oracle risk and you have key management risk as well, which has been quite prevalent, unfortunately, for the past few months.
And do you yourself help the teams to evaluate these risks or help them with this due diligence process, or is that mainly only their internal, let's say, task to come to this decision point?
We help them for sure. At first, by gathering the relevant information documentation from the asset issuers. So that could include, let's say, the term sheets of the underlying funds. We also look into the contract interfaces to understand how exactly the redemption works, if there's any off-chain component that we must be aware of when proceeding with a redemption. So we gather all this information, ranging from the structure of the fund to the tokenized version of the asset when it comes to the contracts. We put everything together and then we present that to capital allocators that are interested in a specific strategy. Now, of course, the audits as well of the asset issuers. So a lot of factors that we try to make as clear as possible to the capital allocators that we work with.
Henrique, on a concluding note, who is your dream client for Symbiotic at this point? Is there any particular asset issuer or risk curator or maybe distribution platform that you would really want to onboard onto Symbiotic in the near future?
There are a few of them, and I'm fortunate enough to say that we are working with the best ones, and I think that will be fulfilling our goals there. We announced Midas as the first one, and the team is great, the product as well. So we'll be starting with them in the next couple of weeks, and then we'll be able to announce the next few ones as well. But I'm glad to say that we are working with the best asset issuers out there, so people will know as soon as we announce it. But those would be like great names, and we'll have the liquidity available as well. We are working with great curators and market makers, so we are bridging all the gaps here and putting everything together to launch very shortly.
All right. Well, we'll be looking forward to more news, more announcements, and more great integrations from you guys. Henrique, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. It was great.